Dawn crept in with the gentleness of a secret, the pale light just brushing the kitchen table when I saw the envelope. Cream paper, expensive, my name written in Claire's neat, hurried hand, the kind that rushes through tenderness before it can feel it. I set down the pruning shears, noticing the faint smear of soil on my palm, and opened it with the tip of a butter knife. One sentence drew the air from the room. "We think it's best if you don't come to the wedding." I stared at it, not quite believing the calmness of my own heartbeat. The kettle clicked off behind me, a perfectly ordinary sound in a moment that was anything but. Steam rose, curling like an unspoken apology. I placed the letter beside the teacup, careful not to crumple it. Dignity demands a steady hand even when the heart falters. Outside, the lila leaned toward morning, needing trimming. I bent to them, clippers precise, the rhythm steadying me. Crying felt childish, silence, safer. My breath matched the hum of bees at the lavender edge, each cut clean, measured. Love, I've learned, can lose its manners quietly. As the sun lifted and the day pretended its innocence, I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in tired wonder, it hadn't always been this cold between us. And with that, I buried the letter under a pile of unopened seed catalogs, the way one hides frost under petals. I met Claire on a late summer afternoon. Sunlight spread like honey across the school courtyard. She was 12, then, thin arms crossed, chin lifted toward defiance, eyes assessing me as if weighing whether kindness could be trusted. Her father, George, stood beside her, trying too hard to smile. I had rehearsed a dozen ways to introduce myself, but when our gazes met, all I could manage was a quiet, "You must be Claire." She nodded, wary and polite. I remember thinking, this is not a beginning, but a negotiation. In those first months, I learned to move carefully through her world. I helped her with algebra, not corrections, but conversation, asking her to teach me the logic she already held in her head. I slipped small encouragements into her packed lunches. A folded quote, a doodled star, sometimes just a note saying, "I see you." She never mentioned them aloud, though I caught her once saving one between the pages of a school book. It was enough to keep trying. There were nights when George fell asleep on the couch, and I stayed up sewing the hem of the dress Claire wanted to wear to her recital. The house smelled faintly of lavender and thread glue, the only sound the ticking clock and the hum of her laughter coming faintly through the hallway as she practiced piano. Those little echoes made me feel, if not yet loved, at least included, an invisible note within her music. Years blurred into familiar routines, breakfast, hurried, homework-strewn, arguments over curfews that ended with door slams and reconciliations, sealed with pancakes. I thought love was slowly doing its quiet work, even if unacknowledged, yet trust was only half-earned. She guarded the other half like an inheritance. When George passed unexpectedly, heart failure, gentle as closing eyes, that unspoken balance collapsed. We held each other at the funeral, each convinced the other's grief took up too much room. Claire left for university soon after, driven more by independence than education. I returned to my classroom, finding solace in other children's progress marks. On papers, future authors and architects who looked at me as if I mattered. Later, when retirement came, it arrived not as a celebration but a silence. The school felt enormous without purpose. Our small town is the kind that still waves at passing cars, still trusts the library more than the internet. My house stands at its edge, painted soft green, its porch shaded by wisteria that blooms early every April. I fill my days with tiding, gardening, and the gentle drone of local radio. On Saturdays, I volunteer at the parish office where new parents bring their laughter and small crises. Sometimes I catch a reflection, a woman solid, sensible, weathered by both duty and love and wonder if that's all I've become. Claire. W.R.I.T.S. infrequently. Her letters, well, emails now arrive spare in tone. Polite updates about the business she calls a studio, photographs of exhibitions too sleek to belong to the girl I knew. The last time I visited, her apartment glimmered with glass and chrome, and her fiancé offered tea as though performing hospitality rather than feeling it. I sensed Claire's discomfort when I praised their ambition. "It's just different, Evelyn," she said. "Not everyone wants roots. On the train home, the city's lights thinned into meadows, and I realized how much effort it takes to keep love alive across landscapes. I still sent her cards for every promotion, every birthday, adding little tokens, linen napkins, antique pearls, pieces of a life that believed in continuity. Perhaps that was my mistaking manners for affection, the exchange of gestures. For trust, the past doesn't end. It shelves itself neatly, waiting. That evening, as the mailbox clattered against the door, memory folded back into present. Beneath my reading lamp, the envelope trembled in my hands. I knew her handwriting immediately, neat, impatient, no wasted loops. I opened it slowly, half hoping for warmth, and instead read the sentence that undid all the years we'd patched. Together, I set the paper down beside the cooling tea and whispered to the empty room, "So this is how we tidy away the past." The call came just after supper, the sort of hour when the house feels more echo than sound. I must let it ring out, but habit won the hope that perhaps just this once she'd changed her mind. Claire's voice was thinner than I remembered, polite around the edges yet trembling underneath. "Evelyn, I wanted to talk before you booked anything. The guest list is, well, intimate." And Dad sighed, "Well, some things are complicated." For a long moment, I said nothing. The kitchen clock ticked its judgment between us. She filled the silence with nervous laughter, explaining that space was limited, that travel budgets were tight, that I would understand. I did, too well. It wasn't logistics, it was embarrassment, the quiet shame of lineage she no longer wished to claim. I gave her the mercy she couldn't ask for. "I see," I said softly. "Of course." We traded civil goodbyes, and when the line clicked dead, the hum of the refrigerator took over. I stood in the half-light, not angry but hollow, trying to locate whatever part of me had expected gratitude. In the hallway mirror, I caught sight of a woman I almost didn't recognize, the slight stoop of aging shoulders, the faint ink of chalk stains that never seemed to wash completely out of my cardigans. Somewhere between classrooms and funerals, I had turned invisible. That night, I opened my laptop and canceled the hotel reservation I'd made months earlier, the one that felt like an act of faith. The confirmation email blinked across the screen. Refund processed. I whispered a small prayer, not for peace but precision, that I might hold my tongue long enough to keep my dignity. The money, I decided, would go to the scholarship fund in George's name. Better use than pities. Indulgence. Word travels fast in towns that measure news by echoes. By morning, the whispers began. At the florist. "Did you hear? Claire's left her stepmother off the list." At the post office, sympathetic smiles disguised as curiosity. They wanted a scene, tears, fury, public wound. I offered only composure. People don't know what to do with stillness. It spreads. Discomfort like fog. Inside, of course, I was shattering quietly. I had once rehearsed a toast full of laughter and sentimental wisdom. Imagine clasping Claire's hands as the photographer caught that rare moment of unguarded love. I had planned to wear my wedding pearls, those small moons of memory passed down from my grandmother. Instead, I opened my jewelry box and closed the lid again, too calmly. The days blurred into small renunciations. I phoned the dressmaker too. Cancel the fitting. I stacked wrapped gifts by the door to be returned. Even the wedding magazine I'd subscribed to just to feel involved, I flipped through its glossy pages one last time, admiring strangers' joy, then slid it into the recycling bin like a benediction. Cleaning became ritual. In the attic, I sorted through boxes labeled with names I hadn't spoken in years, George's textbooks, Claire's school projects, bundles of letters bound with fading ribbon. Each sealed carton felt like sealing away an entire chapter. The summer she learned to ride a bike. The winter George built the greenhouse. The years I believed good intentions could guarantee love. I stacked them neatly, dust rising like ghosts. Now and then I caught myself talking to the quiet. "You'll be proud one day, George," I murmured. "You'll see she finds her footing." Yet pride curdled somewhere behind the words. I knew what Claire never did, that beneath my modest pension there rested an account her father had left untouched. Savings meant for her, her education, her future, The small fortune she assumed never existed? It was still patient in the bank, waiting for her to believe in roots again. There was money, too, from the sale of George's farm equipment, the kind I hadn't required to live modestly. Claire never asked, never knew I'd set aside more than inheritance. The pearls, the letters, the deed to the little cottage that looked out on the lake. I smiled at the irony. All the things she dismissed as outdated were the very things that might one day save her. Outside, the summer air grew heavy, its thickness pressing against the windows. Sunflowers leaned toward dusk, too weary to stand tall. I wiped my hands. On my apron, a faint tremor running through them. Enough of preparation for a celebration I wasn't welcome to. Time to cancel everything, the dress, the gifts, the hope of symbolic closure. It struck me then that surrender was not defeat. Sometimes it was the only language dignity still fluently spoke. Just as I turned to shut off the lamp, a sound interrupted the hollow clang of the mailbox flap. I hesitated, feeling the pulse of habit stir again, another letter. Perhaps another ending waiting to begin. In the quiet weeks that followed, I learned something peculiar about pain. It prefers structure. Mine arranged itself neatly into lists. Phone calls to make, papers to sign, details to settle. Routine dulled what grief could not. I began spending mornings at George's old desk, where the sunlight struck in slanted bars across his ledgers and the scent of cedar still lingered in the drawers. The community trust he'd left behind had grown steadily under my care, a modest pool of money meant for scholarships, local improvements, small acts of good. I had tended it for years, one balanced column at a time, never thinking its purpose might turn into a message rather than a duty. That month, I decided to finalize a bequest within it. A new endowment, unnamed in public record, but privately inscribed in my heart for the children Claire didn't yet have. It seemed an impossible tenderness, to wish well for a generation that might never know my name. Still, numbers bring comfort, and when I signed the transfer, my hand did not shake. The line of ink looked almost ceremonial, a vow written in stillness. Afternoons, I'd drive into town to visit the notary. The route hugged the shore. I'd often pause at the overlook, watching gulls dip through the fog. The radio hummed softly, piano fragments, advertisements for roofing companies, the dull rhythm of ordinary life. On those drives, I was less a mother than a steward of conscience, ferrying decency from one account to another. It was an odd kind of solace, the feeling of giving while unseen. Around that time, a different unease began whispering through conversation. Mr. Leary, the supplier who runs the hardware store, stopped me one morning when I came to buy seed trays. "You wouldn't happen to know Claire's fiance's outfit, would you?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Their company's been slow on payment, big promises, light pockets." I felt that familiar current of disbelief, quick and cold. Claire's letters had been full of praise for his family's construction empire, those shining images of projects and conferences, their successes laid out like trophies. But Leary's frown had its own gravity, and it pulled at something skeptical inside me. That night, I found myself at my desk again, staring at the pale glow of my laptop screen, tracing public records and company reports the way I used to proofread lesson plans line by line, patient, methodical. The truth emerged without drama. A business dressed in borrowed confidence, invoices ignored, debts tucked behind legal phrasing. The man my stepdaughter was preparing to marry had built his castle on paper. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection hovering ghost-like on the screen. The temptation was a living thing: call her, warn her, reclaim some piece of moral authority I'd long ago relinquished. Instead, I brewed tea and sat on the porch till the air cooled. The stars were faint, the kind that require patience to truly see. My thoughts steadied into one conclusion: love that demands control isn't love. Claire would find her truth as I had found mine, late, privately, and at a cost. Vindication, I decided, was far too small a prize for dignity. Over the next few days, I made quiet arrangements. I ensured the trust's paperwork was sheltered, that the scholarship, once activated, would never carry my signature. The anonymity was intentional, a kindness free of performance. I visited, The bank manager, a former student who still addressed me as Ms. Hill, and signed what needed to be signed. When he asked whether I wanted acknowledgement, I smiled. No, I said, some things do their best work unseen. Driving home through rain-misted glass, the wipers beating a slow metronome, I caught a glint of my face in the window-lined, calm, unspectacularly content. I wondered if this was what integrity looked like after 70 winters of weathering, not a bright banner, but a tempered silence. Weeks passed. The wedding advertisements in Claire's social feed grew quieter, the captions more uncertain. Then, one afternoon, as I was labeling boxes of school supplies for next year's scholarship applicants, the phone rang. It was Jonah once. My student, now a local accountant. Did you hear, Miss Hill? That big design project in the city her fiancé's company just went under. Not a soul got paid. I thanked him, careful to keep my voice even. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft but resolute. I took the folders from the table, placed them neatly in the cabinet, and turned off the lamp. Somewhere, across towns and headlines, an extravagant wedding slipped quietly into postponement. And in that dim, ordered room, I exhaled, not in triumph, but in the quiet relief of having done nothing cruel and nothing wrong. The storm arrived swift and certain, the kind of downpour that erases everything but noise. I was trimming stems for the vase on the counter when I saw her headlights flash against the curtains. A car door slammed, hurried footsteps splashed through puddles, and before I could reach the porch, Claire burst through the doorway, hair plastered to her face, mascara bleeding like ink in rain. He was lying, she said, voice splintering. About everything. The words came like pebbles thrown at glass maul, relentless. I handed her a towel, watching her tremble, not from cold, but from the collapse of a world she'd built on faith and appearances. The room smelled faintly of wet wool and the tea I had just brewed. The kettle clicked again, then whistled same sound as the morning that letter had arrived months ago. Circles have their own cruel elegance. She dropped onto the kitchen chair, the fabric sagging beneath her weight. The investors pulled out. His accounts, he faked them. He wasn't who he said he was. Then quieter, I wasn't either. Her face crumpled, not into the child's tears I once knew, but the raw, adult kind that makes no sound. I set the teapot between us, poured her a cup, hand steady, though my chest felt unfastened. I thought I'd done things right, Evelyn, she said through shaking breaths. I worked, I planned, I kept pushing forward. I just wanted to be someone Dad would have been proud of. At his name, something inside me softened and hurt all at once. She hadn't called him Dad in years, not in my presence. The fact that grief had reopened the word was its own fragile mercy. You don't have to explain, I said carefully. It's a hard thing, seeing the layers come off and realizing pride was wearing your face all along. She looked up, eyes red. I didn't just hurt myself. I hurt you too. I told you not to come to the wedding. God, I actually wrote it like we were strangers, and you said nothing. You didn't even fight me. The kettle's whistle rose again, persistent, almost accusing. I turned it off and set it aside. Sometimes. Silence is the only way we can love someone who isn't listening, I said. Arguing would have made it uglier. I wanted you to keep your picture of me, even if it made me small. She pressed both hands over her mouth, trying to stem the sob. It burst anyway, a low, shuddering sound that filled the room. Then through the blur of apology, her eyes caught sight of a brown envelope resting on the counter, half covered by yesterday's newspaper. I had left it there absent-mindedly when sorting trust paperwork earlier that morning. The logo small, embossed bore George's name. What's this? She asked, dragging the pages free before I could answer. Her gaze skipped lines. A quiet incredulity grew on her face. A scholarship? Dad's trust? This is you, isn't it? She looked up, disbelief trembling into awe. You did this? For me? For them? I nodded once. My throat tightened suddenly, memory catching up to composure. It was meant to continue his work, to plant something good in his name. Someday I hoped your children, when they came, might feel that their grandfather's heart still looked after them. Her fingers curled around the documents, paper dampened by tears. You did all this, After I told you not to come? I almost wish she hadn't asked. The words carried an ache too delicate for pride. It wasn't for thanks, I said. It was just right. Love doesn't need an audience, Claire. It only needs direction. She shook her head, lost between wonder and guilt. I was awful to you. So convinced I'd outgrown this town that you'd never understand what I was building. And you were building something the whole time, quietly, for me. I hesitated, then reached across the table, folded her hand in mine. Her fingers were icy. You already had what I wanted to give, I said softly. My belief that you could fall and stand again. I just needed to let you prove it. A sound escaped her then, something between a sob and a laugh, a release of weight. She slid from the chair to the tiled floor, knees to chest, head bowed. The rain drummed softly on the window, as if embarrassed to watch. I bent to gather her into my arms. Her hair smelled faintly of hotel shampoo and city rain. Steam rose from the forgotten kettle, clouding the edges of everything: walls, memory, even regret. For a moment we were just two women breathing in sync, past and future pressed into one quiet heartbeat. I don't know how to fix it, she murmured against my shoulder. Some things repair themselves, I said, if you stop tugging at the seams. We stayed like that until the storm softened into drizzle. When finally she lifted her head, the tremor in her body had steadied. Into stillness, she reached for her cup, took a sip. It's still warm, she whispered. Yes, I said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. This house keeps heat better than it keeps anger. Outside, the clouds began to lighten, surrendering edges of blue. Inside, silence expanded, not the brittle kind we had once. Sheltered in, but something gentler, with air enough for both of us to breathe. Claire leaned her head against my lap, eyes closed, tears drying into sleep. I stroked her hair, the rhythm instinctive, ancient. The kettle's faint hiss tapered off. The garden beyond the window glistened where rain clung to leaves. For the first time in years, the house exhaled as if the storm had brought home what pride had driven away. The days that followed had the softness of a long exhale after years of holding breath. The rain left puddles like small mirrors across the yard, and Claire took to kneeling in the garden, cutting back ivy, loosening roots, learning the patience of soil. She used to call these flowers old-fashioned. Now she tended them as if they could hear her penance. I watched from the porch, apron dusted with flour, remembering how love, once purified by loss, stops performing and simply breathes. We spoke little of her fiancés or the wedding that never was. Some shamas are quieter when shared wordlessly. She stayed through the week, mending her own silences with chores, fixing loose shutters, sweeping the hallway, baking her first pie that didn't quite set. I let her talk when she needed, but more often we worked side by side, the kind of closeness that doesn't demand language. Letters began to arrive, cousins, aunts, even her godmother, each written with sympathy that arrived just late enough to sting. They admitted in cautious tones that perhaps they'd misjudged, that perhaps the spectacle of pride had been mistaken for maturity. I answered each note with a brief line or two: thank you, all is well. Time sorts what words cannot. The act of forgiveness, I discovered, was not about releasing others. It was about freeing one's own lungs. Rumors, of course, surfaced in town. At the grocer's counter, a voice too sweet by half murmured, "She never raised her voice, yet now she's the one they all admire." I pretended not to hear. Vindication, lovely as it sounds, is an emotion that spoils if lingered on. Dignity lasts longer when unattended. Instead, I baked dozens of loaves for the parish fair, the smell of yeast and cinnamon weaving through the house like comfort itself. Claire joined, laughing at her own clumsiness as dough clung to her wrists. In the evenings, we sat on the porch steps and let the air cool our hands. The space between us no longer felt guarded. It simply was. By the time the first leaves began their slow surrender to gold, her visits had turned habitual. The city called less urgently. Here, she found quieter work designing modest spaces for schools and libraries. Real people projects, she called them, half amused, half proud. Watching her measure sunlight through the kitchen window for curtains, I realized how change rarely arrives with thunder. It trickles in like daylight through lace. Autumn came fully, gentle as forgiveness itself. The parish held its harvest. Service, the pews lined with jars of jam and sheaves of wheat. I stood to read the chosen verse, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." My voice felt steady, grounded. Claire's eyes met mine from the front row, her smile small but sure. And as I closed the book, the brass bells outside began to ring, scattering sound across the fields, a reminder that even endings, when tended kindly, can ripen into peace. A full year has circled by, measured not in months but in gentler habits. Claire's life, once stretched between ambition and anxiety, has found shape again. She now works with an educational charity, designing learning spaces for underfunded schools, the kind of classrooms that smell of chalk and hope. When she describes her projects, her eyes brighten with a calm fervor I'd never seen before. She phones often, sometimes just to share a recipe, sometimes to ask advice about soil, wiring, budgets. And once a month, without fail, she drives down the old lane, parks beneath the wisteria, and sets her bags inside with the ease of someone who has found her way home. Our bond no longer relies on politeness or performance. It settles, steady and true, like furniture finally arranged to fit the room. She teases me now about my tidy handwriting and overwatered basil. We laugh easily, no longer afraid of the quiet between words. The town, ever observant, seems to have accepted this gentle unison as though it had always been so. I spend my mornings, as I always did, tending the garden, steeping tea, watching the light sift through the lace curtains. There's another wedding on the horizon, yes, but this one feels different. Small, honest, rooted in gratitude more than spectacle. Claire has asked me to stand with her, not beside, but slightly behind the spot where a mother might once have stood. The gesture speaks more loudly than any apology ever could. On the morning of the ceremony, the sun rises pale and gold across the lilac bush. The kettle clicks off, releasing that familiar whisper of steam. I smooth my dress, not in vanity, but reverence, and think how far forgiveness has carried us further than pride ever dreamed. Some invitations aren't written on paper, they're earned in forgiveness. And as I step onto the porch, petals glinting under the new light, I think of that first letter and how differently my heart reads it now. I once measured love by who asked me to come. Now I measure it by who came back, asterisk.